Hello everyone, and a very warm welcome. Today, we are going to explore a really fascinating question, one of the biggest questions in biology actually. How are characteristics, or traits, passed down from one generation to the next? This is the science of heredity, and it explains exactly why you might have your father's smile, or maybe your grandmother's curly hair. So let's begin our journey.
Have you ever really thought about this? You look in the mirror and you see this wonderful mix of your family looking right back at you. This simple observation, this is our starting point today. Together we are going to uncover the scientific rules that create this beautiful family resemblance.
To solve this mystery, we'll follow a very clear path. First, we will look at the family resemblance mystery. Then, we will learn the very important difference between the traits we are born with and those we pick up along the way. After that, we will meet a scientific detective named Mendel, uncover some dominant and recessive clues, and finally, we'll start decoding our genetic makeup.
So, let's start with the basics. The process of reproduction creates new individuals who are very similar to their parents, but they are never identical copies. There are always some small, subtle differences. This is what scientists call variation, and it is the reason that every single one of us is absolutely unique.
And here is a very, very important point. Inheritance is a team effort. The rules of heredity are built on one key fact. Both the mother and the father contribute practically equal amounts of genetic material to their child. This means that for every single characteristic, you receive a set of instructions from both of your parents.
So the traits that are passed down from your parents are called inherited traits. Now these are controlled by something called genes. You can think of them as tiny little instruction manuals for building and running your body. It is these inherited traits that we are going to focus on today. Now this is a very important difference, so let's pay close attention. On one side, we have inherited traits like your eye color or your natural hair type. These are written in the genes you get from your parents. On the other side, we have acquired traits. These are things you develop during your own life, like learning to swim, getting a scar from an injury, or building muscle from exercise. And here is the key point to remember. Only the inherited traits can be passed on to the next generation.
And here is a perfect, simple example of an inherited trait. Take a look at the earlobes. Some people have free earlobes that hang down, while others have attached earlobes that connect directly to the side of the head. This is a classic inherited trait, a simple characteristic passed down through genes, just like eye color.
So how did we figure all of this out? Well, let us meet the main character in our story, a scientific detective named Gregor Mendel. He used simple garden pea plants to solve the incredibly complex puzzle of inheritance.
This is Gregor Mendel. And what made his work so brilliant was his approach. He combined biology with mathematics. You see, he was the first person to carefully count the individuals with each trait in every single generation. This methodical counting allowed him to see patterns that everyone else before him had simply missed.
But why did he choose pea plants for his investigation? Of all things! Well, they were the perfect subjects. They grow very quickly, so he could study many generations in a short amount of time. And most importantly, they had clear, contrasting traits. For example, a plant was either tall or short. There was no in-between. Its seeds were either round or wrinkled. This clarity was the key to his discoveries.
Right. Let's walk through his first experiment, step by step. He started with a pure-breeding tall plant and a pure-breeding short plant and crossed them. This is the parent, or P, generation. Then he looked at their children, which we call the F1, or first generation. And this is where he found his first big surprise. Every single one of the F1 plants was tall. The trait for shortness, it seemed to have vanished into thin air.
This was the big question that Mendel had to answer. Was the trait for shortness gone forever, or was it just hiding somewhere? This was the mystery he had to solve.
So, Mendel continued his experiment with great care. He took those tall plants from the F1 generation and allowed them to self-pollinate. And when he looked at their offspring, the next generation, which we call F2, he got his big reveal. The short trait was back. It had not disappeared after all. It was simply hidden in that first generation. And the short trait didn't just come back randomly. No, because Mendel counted everything, he noticed a clear pattern. He found that for every one short plant, there were about 3 tall plants. This 3-to-1 ratio appeared again and again in his experiments. This was not a coincidence. It was a fundamental rule of inheritance.
So, how can we explain this predictable pattern? This observation led Mendel to develop some absolutely brilliant ideas about how traits are passed on.
He gave us the clues to crack the genetic code.
Mendel proposed that some traits are dominant. A dominant trait, like tallness, is the one that is expressed or seen even if only one copy of its gene is present. It's important to understand, dominant does not mean better or stronger. It simply means it is the trait that is physically visible. In that F1 generation, the dominant tallness trait completely masked the shortness trait.
The other type of trait he called recessive. A recessive trait, like shortness, is the one that is hidden when the dominant trait is present. It only appears or is expressed when an individual has two copies of that recessive gene. That is exactly why the short plants reappeared in the F2 generation.
This brings us to a very important idea in genetics. You see, there is a difference between what we see on the outside and the set of genetic instructions that are hidden on the inside.
Okay, let us break this down slowly. The phenotype is the physical appearance, what you can actually see. For example, that a plant is tall. The genotype is the genetic code, the combination of genes that creates that appearance. A good way to think of it is this. The phenotype is like the cover of a book, but the genotype is the actual story written inside. So a tall plant can have two different genotypes, two different stories, capital T, or capital T, small t. But a short plant, it can only have one genotype, small t, small t.
Now this table explains that 3-to-1 ratio we saw earlier. When we look at the genotypes in the F2 generation, we find a ratio of 1TT to 2TT to 1TT. Now because capital T for tallness is dominant, both the TT plant and the 2TT plants look tall. So we add them together. 1 plus 2 gives us 3 tall-looking plants for every 1 short TT plant. And this is how the genotype ratio of 1:2:1 creates the phenotype ratio of 3:1.
So, let us recap the key takeaways from our explainer today. First, traits are passed from parents to children through genes. Second, we get 2 copies of the gene for each trait, one from our mother and one from our father. Third, some traits are dominant and they can hide recessive traits. And finally, this means a recessive trait can be carried silently through a family's genes and passed on, even if we don't see it in every generation.
We have now cracked the case for a single trait. But what happens when we start tracking 2 traits at the same time? For example, if we cross a plant that is both tall and has round seeds with one that is short and has wrinkled seeds. Do those traits always stick together? Well, that is a question for our next investigation. Thank you for joining me.